frankly, Rishi Sunak's budget was in itself a signpost that neoliberalism has run out of road.
Today, we seem to be enamoured with crisis after crisis, with the 2008 economic collapse, a global pandemic, war returning to Europe, climate catastrophe, and the cost of living crisis. Today, I'm joined by Richard Murphy, who is a professor of accounting at Sheffield University Management School, co-founder for the Green New Deal, and a columnist at the national newspaper in Scotland. Richard, welcome to Turn Left.
Hello.
In response to Rishi Sunak, which was the budget a few weeks ago, you made a wider point about the future of globalisation, or lack thereof. Why is globalisation failing?
Well, look, what I looked at in the context of what Rishi Sunak had to say, but obviously in the broader context of the world that we're seeing. And add all this up and we suddenly see that 40 years of economic thinking, neoliberalism underpinning globalization through what we might conveniently call the Washington Consensus, those ideas are breaking down. Partly they're breaking down by choice, political choice. So in the UK, in a sense, we saw the country decide to leave the globalization movement. We chose to do Brexit. We chose to put in place barriers to trade. We chose to actually increase tariffs when the whole logic of the globalization movement has been towards total freedom of movement of trade and capital. So we can see that there is a political demand for change within the UK, which rejects globalization. But now we're seeing something else as well, very clearly. We're seeing the war in Ukraine, we're seeing the sanctions on Russia, we're seeing alliances that we hadn't anticipated even months ago becoming very visible. A Russia, Hungary, India, backed by China as well, alliance, which is putting forward a very different worldview, a very different trading bloc view of the way the world should work compared to the way that we've been anticipating in the past. So the logic that the West, and I'll use the term loosely, but it will be around OECD countries, if you like, have been putting forward that they can create a world trading system in which others are invited to participate, including the likes of Russia and China, and which those countries are presumed will be participating in. Well, that's no longer working. They've said these rules don't apply to us anymore. We can do what we like. So they're not accepting the political norms. Russia is engaging war in Europe, but they're also rejecting the underpinning economic logic. They're saying we're not going to play your game of trade. Add all that together, and if we have a failure of globalization, we get a failure of fundamental chains of supply, so gas and oil, but also food and fertilizer and raw materials like nickel, which 90% of the world's supply comes from Russia. All of those things might well break down. The assumption that we're one integrated world has suddenly ceased to have very much relevance. We appear to be a decidedly divided world. How do we survive in that world is the question that we might now need to be asking.
Is there not a point to be made that it's a new phase of globalization, one in which the system prevails, but with different participants? Obviously, you've mentioned other players already. So in globalization in which the UK, the US, the West are no longer the powerhouses and countries like China are becoming the new hegemonic force, is that not still the form of globalization, just different players?
Obviously, it is possible that simply the terms of trade have changed. That's your argument, in a sense, that whereas previously we were all going to trade using the dollar fundamentally as the world currency, and we were going to accept the terms of trade as laid down by WTO as the underpinning core assumption, and then OECD tax rules and so on, all of which were basically regulating the way in which flows would occur, and even underpinning that, things like the Financial Action Task Force and how illicit money was going to be taken out of the system. All of those fundamental building blocks, which were seen to be upholding the types of Western financial capitalism and its banking system, which frankly have driven a lot of this globalization model. I don't see that those are surviving right now. We are seeing, for example, the separation of the payment system for Russia from the SWIFT payments mechanism used by other banks. And we are seeing that China and India and Russia certainly are beginning to look at other payment mechanisms between them. They are creating new structures for trade, which are built upon different international agreements, which they will be putting in place, different structures which are not consistent. So the barriers to trade will actually grow. Now, given that globalization was about reducing the barriers of trade, the fact that actually these blocs may wish to trade in different ways with different rules from those which the West is still trying to promote and use means that there will be rival globalizations. Now, can you have rival globalizations? Does one globe support two globalizations? Or are we actually seeing something quite different? We are actually seeing rival blocs emerging. Go back to 1992, we had the argument then, the end of history, it was said, the liberal democracies had won against the power of the Soviet state. Here it was, the end of time had arrived. In effect, the ultimate goal was liberal democracy. And today, we can't say that for sure. We've seen reducing freedoms in many of the liberal democracies anyway. We've seen, frankly, the collapse of democracy in many countries. And as we record, we're noting that Orban has won another election in Hungary, where the power to change the constitution is granted to him yet again, so he can recreate things in his own favor once more. These are things which are fundamentally changing the building block. We can't even assume democracy is there anymore. So I think that, frankly, the idea that globalization is potentially on the rocks is one that is sustainable, and that what is being built is not an alternative terms of trade within globalization, but an entirely new power relationship around the world. Putting this into a UK context, which is where I started, because I began my debate about this issue within the context of Rishi Sunak's budget. Frankly, Rishi Sunak's budget was in itself a signpost that neoliberalism has run out of road.
Well, it's clear that Rishi Sunak is completely a neoliberal politician, but it was worth noting that Boris Johnson did tap into something beyond neoliberalism, which is government intervention. Obviously, with the furlough scheme, we had that. So Boris Johnson did seem to understand that people are turning against free markets. So why is Rishi Sunak continuing this trend of neoliberalism? Surely the Conservatives know it's no longer popular. Aren't they going to be changing their rhetoric, or at least their policies, a bit more heading into the future? Now, it might be a more of an authoritarian government, which is what I expect, but they can't be continuing neoliberal policies when surely they know it's not popular.
Well, you pick up the most important word there, and that is, and you pick up the divide. The divide is between Rishi Sunak, who is, I think, what I would describe as neoliberal to his core, reflecting the standard model of economics, which has been taught by most universities for too long. I actually was a product of a university before that era. I was actually taught Keynes back in the 70s, but nobody is taught that now. And neoliberalism then was a bit of a footnote and a bit of a joke, but from 1980s onwards, it has not been. He's an absolutely standard product of the neoliberal mold. He does believe in small government. He believes in balanced budgets. He believes that it is the government's job to simply provide a stable currency, and thereafter it is up to the market to decide. Now, Boris Johnson is not from that mold. I mean, whatever mold Boris Johnson is from, and that's extremely hard to answer because I don't think Boris Johnson could answer that question himself. He has one dominating political thought, which is, please elect me, please keep me in power. He is only interested in power in that sense, and he's a populist as a consequence. And you use the word popular. Well, I would use populist. Boris Johnson will spend money if it provides him with the support he needs to remain in power. Is he particularly worried about the consequences of that? No, because he recognizes, as every realistic person probably does, that his life as a politician is finite, and therefore at some point he will not be in power, but he wants to remain so now. So if that requires that he spend money, as he did during the entire furlough period, as I think he would be doing now. I think he would have quite happily cancelled, for example, the national insurance tax increase, which Rishi Sunak insisted was necessary to supposedly support the NHS, which clearly it was not. He would have quite happily spent more money to try to resolve NHS backlogs, which quite clearly the government in what quite clearly the Treasury did not permit. So there is a core divide, which is absolutely right down the middle of this Conservative government between the dying neoliberals and the Johnsonite populists, neither of whom have a solution that suits the needs of this country, because both have a view which is, in a sense, go hang yourselves. We're not going to help you. We're going to help ourselves in some way or other.
Well, both politicians are very short-sighted. One is Rishi with the neoliberal approach, that's short-sighted as we're moving into a new era, and Boris Johnson is short-sighted because all he cares about is power and he's making decisions just to keep himself there. None of them have a long-term vision, and nor does the Conservative Party, unless you have anything you want to say about that, because I'm really interested in Conservative parties like the Republicans in America and Conservatives across the globe, that they are fundamentally neoliberal. The policies are fundamentally free market. But in order to survive as a political force, they're going to have to change. But what sort of new conservatism are we going to see from them?
It's a very interesting question, to which the only answer I can come up with is it's for being against them. In other words, they do see the world as divided, and this is at the very core of right-wing thinking now, that the world is made up of us and them. We're right, they're wrong. They're oppressing us, therefore we must fight them. And the whole logic of populism is that we will beat those who are oppressing us. So we had, Nigel Farage claiming that he was at one point, fighting an elite of which he was very clearly a part. We have Boris Johnson claiming he's fighting an elite of which he's very clearly a part. We had Donald Trump saying he'd clear the swamp of the very people who he put in there to office, in effect. He cleared nothing of any swamp. But there is this image, which is the basis of the appeal, that somehow we're fighting those who oppress us. And there are a lot of people who are, as a consequence of neoliberalism, very angry with what they see as the oppression they've been forced to suffer: austerity, lower benefits, lower pensions, reduced public services, and so on. And in a very cynical and manipulative move, there's a duality of approach inside modern right-wing politics, which takes the anger with the policies that politics has itself created and manages to turn that anger onto the left to blame them as the elite, which apparently opposed it. So what they're doing is turning the firepower of their supporters on the social democratic movements, which adopted neoliberalism as being the only acceptable way to power, and making those social democrats the enemy now, even though it is in fact entirely true that what the governments on the right are supplying is something that, frankly, in many cases would be hard to differentiate from that which the social democrats would deliver. So we're seeing a politics of narrative going on, which is actually distinct from the politics of supply going on. There's a break between what's actually happening inside these governments, who know they've got to continue to supply pensions and education and healthcare, or whatever it is that are the core basis of the contract between them and the people. I actually think there is a social contract, and they recognize that if they break that social contract, they'll be out of power. But at the same time, they're running a narrative which is decidedly different and distinct from it. And there's a lie, therefore, at the very core of right-wing politics now. And that lie is that somehow there is another option available, even though those who are promoting the idea that another option is available have no idea what it is. But they'll use that lie to win support against those who are actually delivering the very services that these governments are still supplying, whilst undermining.
Well, we've sort of seen in the last 5 to 10 years of the Conservatives or Conservative parties using culture wars as a way to drum up support. So you were alluding to that before. There was a disconnect between the economic policy and the narrative. But we've seen that shift. We've seen right-wingers trying to create a new elite. And then this now new elite is the woke brigade, the LGBTQ plus community. These are the new elites, and the white middle class people. They're being oppressed here. So, of course, we have seen that, and that's where you've got populism from Trump and many others using these very insidious arguments. But once again, that seems quite short-sighted to me because, yes, it's very popular right now. People are angry due to austerity, due to lack of jobs, due to their material conditions, and obviously you get demagogues come in and get that anger and direct it to other people. But once they're in power, when people's material conditions don't improve, in 10, 20 years, people surely going to ask questions. Now, obviously, that's the role of the left to say it's your material conditions, but the Conservatives surely don't have answer for that. They can use the culture wars and create a moral panic, but that's all they have. It doesn't seem very future-proof.
I say this isn't the politics of narrative rather than the politics of reality. It's a politics in a sense of hate, of course, as well. And let's be very worried about that because the politics of hate have been used to create very powerful movements in the past. You pick on a group, you declare them to be the enemy, you vilify them to the point that eventually society thinks they are other, literally other than them. They're not human. And we've done it to migrants throughout history. And that worries me immensely. The government does at the present point of time want to take away my right to a British passport because I have got an Irish passport, and anybody with the right to, or actually who has a British passport and another passport, they're saying, well, up to us whether you keep your nationality or not. So that sort of idea of the other is implicit in this. The LGBTQ community is really very strange because the Tories clearly have those who are gay in their ranks, and now we have a trans MP on the Tory benches, and they say you're very welcome, and at the same time Boris Johnson is making jokes about trans people in a speech to Tory MPs, and they are aiming comment at the Labour Party who are trying to address the very difficult issue of gender identity. This whole thing about the political debate they're putting forward, the woke debate, if you like, that they suggest, and I don't accept the term woke in a sense. I mean, who can be anti-equality? But that's what they appear to be. I mean, how can you be anti-racism? I mean, well, therefore, are you a racist? Are you anti-equality? So you're in favour of inequality? All of those things, I don't get that. But what they're trying to do is, and whenever you say something that offends them, they clutch their pearls. They say, oh, you've offended me, you've upset me. Well, I'm sorry, but actually, you're being immoral. And I have reserved the right to call out your immorality. And again, I think the left isn't strong enough about this. I think we have to make clear that what we're addressing is a moral crisis, which is inherent within right-wing politics.
After the pandemic, it's still sort of going on, but I hoped that despite obviously how terrible COVID has been for us, that it was going to give us an opportunity to reimagine our relationship to work with better work-life balance, higher pay, better conditions. But to me, it seems like life has sort of gone back to the things they were. Work practices seem to be, on a whole, to be no different. There's been a real lack of debate in improving material conditions in a meaningful way, don't you think?
Really quite surprising, isn't it? We had the most massive shock to the way in which we worked since 1972, when we had the 3-day week. I don't think you were probably alive then, but I was. I was doing homework.
You gave it away.
I don't think I can guess. Look, there's a difference in the color of our hair or something like that. Something suggests. But we've now had a different challenge, and that was, of course, lockdown and working from home. And we discovered that a great deal of life carried on. And of course, it didn't for everybody. And some people had to be on the front line. And I've been by that, not just NHS workers, but people in supermarkets and food processing and all sorts of other things where it happened. But what we did learn was that it was actually possible in the face of challenge to actually change the way we worked remarkably quickly, to rethink what we did. And it was also possible for the government to rethink its own role. And it did. 400 billion was created. Money was created out of thin air. There was no request to the taxpayer. There was no new borrowing during that period from the financial markets, in effect. It was simply the Bank of England created the money to pay for an intervention to keep the economy going, to deal with the crisis. It made it possible, it made it clear, therefore, that it was possible, as you say, to rethink the way we worked, the way we tried to use the government's macroeconomic toolbox, including money creation, including the way we use tax as a social instrument, including the way in which we can use the interest rate to promote or discourage activity and so on, but not necessarily as a mechanism for achieving the balanced book budget that has been the paranoia of neoliberalism. We could have achieved so much if we now sat down. But first of all, I don't think the left grabbed the opportunities as well as it could have done. I tried pretty hard, and I think some others tried pretty hard during the course of this to think what could happen afterwards. And I did a lot of discussion, for example, on the need for the taxation of wealth. Not because we needed the money, but because inequality was clearly an issue that had to be addressed during the course of the pandemic, because we don't actually need the money from the wealthy. We know that we can create the money to pay for all public services anyway. What we need to do is actually use tax as an instrument for social change. And that's what I argued during that period. We could have argued that this was a time when we re-understood the purpose of the corporation. We could have realized that if they were being underpinned by the state, and most were during this period, the whole narrative has been, let's get back to normal. Just as it was after 2009 or 2008-9, it was like, let's get back to normal. As if, and let me explain why I think that happens. There is, of course, taught inside neoliberal economics, this idea that there is a thing called equilibrium. Equilibrium is the state of nirvana, or where the economy runs as it should to perfection, which will happen when all businesses are profit maximizing and there's minimum interference from government. And this is the state of well-being to which we all should aspire. And it is apparently stable, which is really quite bizarre, because there's never been a period of stability inside history.
The political zeitgeist is changing from the elites. As you alluded to before about global trade, there's no longer the sort of free trade in the zeitgeist. And also Fukuyama, who is, well, he says it's no longer conservative, but he's come round to the idea of social democracy. He's even, I wouldn't say fervently arguing, but he's even open to the idea of public transport. And he said, I'm leaning more into social democracy or being a social democrat. So I guess there's that zeitgeist of much more stronger welfare state. There doesn't seem to be that much a debate surrounding it. I feel like it's happening almost behind closed doors. Some of these economic thinkers are probably moving towards the centre left, to a much more, like the golden era of the welfare state. But I'm not seeing it on the political stage, and we're not seeing even it from the current Labour Party in their direction. So I'm not seeing that debate happen really in public.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. In fact, I'm actually working on a new book at the moment. And in one chapter, I discussed the role of government. And I was actually working on a draft of this literally yesterday. So this is fresh in my mind. And you're absolutely right. We have right-wing thinkers who've moved towards the left, just as we've had, let's be honest, left-wing thinkers who've moved towards neoliberalism. I mean, the precise boundaries between the state and private sector are always going to be a little bit flexible. They're always going to be the subject of some debate as to where the line should be drawn. Which utilities would be better off in public control because they're natural monopolies and which aren't. Is there an argument that water is clearly absolutely fundamental, so it should be in state control? I'd say yes. Does the same apply to railways? Well, not in the same way, except for the fact that from a pragmatic point of view, we've discovered it's extremely hard to run trains from too many suppliers down one track. So how can we have an effective competition when there's a limited number of tracks available anyway? And so is that another utility to be owned? All of those things are indications of greyness. There's a scale. But we play politics on the basis that we have black and white. And we choose which is black and which is white. And so the right wing will play themselves as the fantastic players, and they are playing that small state model. If only we could get rid of the state, everything would be great, when they know full well that in practice they can't get rid of the state. And then we have the model from the left, which is portrayed by the right as being actually a deep socialist model. And actually, when I look at what supposedly left-wing parties are offering, and frankly, I'm going to characterize here the Liberal Democrats, Labour, SNP as being remarkably similar. I think I might put Plaid slightly different, and I might put the Greens in a slightly different category, but certainly the three largest left of centre parties in the UK Parliament, if we can call Liberal Democrats left of centre, and they would like to think themselves that, are all remarkably similar. So the left simply doesn't actually play up to the stereotype of what the left is about. It is not delivering an answer which is beyond the market. unless we are willing to actually draw on that idea and those relationships and say it is our job to provide access, it is our job to provide opportunity, it is our job, but not just as notions, but actually real opportunities, because again, too much of the left's narrative around these things, and particularly the Labour parties at the moment, is, oh, we'll provide opportunity, but they never explain what that means. I really mean access to capital, for example, which the state has proven that it can supply to businesses when it is necessary, as it was during COVID, so that people can go and explore the opportunity to run an enterprise using capital that is made available, which it is not to many people. Then, and until we actually build those ideas in a way that actually results in the true generation of wealth to the capacity of the people we have in the country, then until we actually get that idea going, then and implicit in our politics, we're miles away from reflecting what people's needs are in the discussions that we have.
You made a really good point earlier about, obviously, you support a wealth tax, but actually it's not a way to bring in money. We don't actually need to do that. It's a way of just curbing inequality. Obviously, you can't have multimillionaires and billionaires because they it's anti-democratic, but we don't actually need it for the funds, because you also said that the left didn't grasp those the almost the MMT aspect of it.
MMT is actually what happens in the world. Modern monetary theory simply describes what actually happens when governments spend money. The government, when it spends money, creates new money at the Bank of England on overdraft, in effect, and spends it. It does not go and check, is there money in the bank account before we can spend it. There isn't ever a day when the government says, oh, sorry, can't pay the pensions because we haven't got any money in the bank today. It can always run an overdraft because it owns its own bank. Nobody else is in that situation, in that unique situation of A, declaring that the currency it creates is legal, and B, having a bank that can issue it. It's totally unique, and so but not unique to the UK, obviously a characteristic shared by quite a number of countries, and we can therefore create money, and so the government can't run out of money either, so it is also the ultimate place for people to save with. We don't have a national debt. We just have a very effective national savings system. Let's be blunt about this. I mean, one of the many narratives that has been used wholly destructively is this idea of national debt. No, actually, the whole point about the national debt is it's an amazing place for people to save their money, because it is the government who can always repay, and nobody else has that characteristic anywhere. Every bank can fail, but the government can't. So that's why people want to save that. And we should be using that power of the government to create money, and also to be the depositor, the place of safety for people to save, as a combined power to reallocate the power of the economy itself.
I don't want to get into any previous political battles, but you left the Corbyn project in the early years over the economic direction they took. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed that some involved pushed a more traditional tax and spend programme of increasing tax to invest and using narratives that you described as neoliberal, in which it was a sort of progressive economic orthodox. Now, John McDonnell very much wanted to be seen as a respectable statesman and pushed the idea that Labour were fiscally responsible through redistributive policies, and ditched the original plan that was dubbed the People's QE, a project in which the government can indeed pay for anything that's needed. So going forward for the left, do we need to argue for a more radical approach to spending, rather than using to be honest, a pretty easy to understand and popular policy of redistribution, something McDonnell thought was a much easier sell to the public?
I mean, in 2014-15, Andrew Fisher, who actually wrote Jeremy Corbyn's basically his manifesto to become leader of the Labour Party, used a lot of my material for Jeremy as the basis of his economic appeal. And I know full well that it was very popular with audiences to whom Jeremy spoke during the course of the campaign to become leader of the Labour Party. I know there are some academics who say, look, he became leader because of me, because I gave him a narrative, an economic narrative, which was so distinct and so different, from which people said, hey, look, this is so unlike what was being offered by Yvette Cooper and others at the time, which sounded like pure neoliberalism and hardcore austerity to continue. The moment he got into office, and John was very little around during the course of that campaign, by the way, when he was on holiday for much of it, in fact. When he got into office, John was sat upon by very conventional Labour MPs who became members of his shadow treasury team and told, you must say you won't borrow, you must accept the limits on spending, you must sign up to the fiscal charter that George Osborne has prepared as an elephant trap for you. And John told me within days of the victory that he was going to do that at the Labour Party conference in September 2015. And I said, well, that's fine. You've offered me the job as your chief economic advisor and I don't want it because I can't work on that basis. There is no credit card to max out and all the other phrases that he used as a Labour chancellor quite irresponsibly. He really became quite orthodox in his thinking. I remember once telling Polly Toynbee, the trouble with John McDonnell is he's so right-wing. Now, that did not make me some mad left-winger. It just put John McDonnell fair and square in the middle of neoliberalism. And bluntly, that's where he was. And he'll hate me for saying it. And he hasn't spoken to me for a long time. And we used to know each other well. But I'm afraid that's what he became the moment, power came his way. It was deeply disappointing. I think that the state has this major role to play. And in fact, I think we need to think further. I go further than MMT. And I've been talking about this with what I call green quantitative easing, but also around how to fund the Green New Deal work I've done with the Green New Deal group. We look at the power of capital. And the power of capital is the government to actually provide this safe place of saving for people. And that we should be using this to actually redirect savings within the economy for social good. There's 8.4 trillion pounds worth of financial wealth supposedly in the UK economy at present, of which about 75% is in pension funds. Quite a lot more, 700 billion is in ISA accounts, and both of those are tax incentivized. 82% of all financial wealth in the UK is in tax incentivized accounts. I don't see any reason why the government shouldn't be using its ability to provide incentives to redirect money towards social good. Why aren't ISAs required to be in savings accounts, which are entirely used for the purpose of funding green investment or social investment like new social housing and so on, where green and social coincide, or flood defences or new forms of energy supply and so on, all the things that we know we are going to need to deal with the crises we're going to face. Why isn't it the case that in exchange for the £60 billion a year we spend on subsidising pension funds, 60 billion, which is vastly more than the defence budget, for example, to subsidise pension funds, why aren't we demanding that actually some of the contributions that people make into their pension funds are directed towards, again, social investment? To me, it just seems completely logical. We have to tie up something that we have not tied up for a long time on the left, the idea that there is wealth and we have to reorganise our thinking about wealth in a way that says, okay, we are going to have a society where there is going to be disparity in saving. That is a fact. We don't seem to find a way around that. And no wealth tax is going to solve that. And no description of the old type Clause 4 style will actually get over this. We're going to have to accept that there are going to be disparities. But how then do we put this idea of saving or wealth into a social perspective and use the power of the state to redirect that towards social purpose? If 80% of all current savings are directed by taxation, and they are, or more than 80% are, then it's the power of the state to actually redirect those towards social gain.
The final point I want to make is to slightly go back to the 2017 manifesto. Again, I don't want to spend too much on the Labour Party, but in a way, maybe I'm being facetious here, but it feels like that the end point was the same in terms of policy, whether narratively you took it on the so-called neoliberal approach of balancing the books and taxing the rich to pay for services, or whether there is no limit to what the government can do in terms of spending. We can just do it. But the policies that came out from those manifestos were what we all support. So it is a lot easier to grasp to say to people, look, we are going to tax the rich. And obviously people felt like it was the moral thing to do as well. I find it very, and I'm very much sympathise with the People's Queue. I'm really agree with what you're saying here, but it's very hard to convince people to say, look, after a global pandemic where we're £2 trillion in debt, the role of the left now, the new project of the left, or the new left, should we say, is to say that don't worry about balancing books and don't worry about debts and all that sort of stuff. We can just pay for it. Even though I agree with that, that seems a lot harder to turn into a electoral political project than to simply say is we can just redistribute that wealth. So I feel like the narrative is different, and that's where you very much disagreed in the direction Corbyn or maybe McDonnell pulled Jeremy Corbyn into. But it feels like the ends were the same, if even if the means weren't.
I think there were things about Jeremy's policies which I didn't agree with. I mean, there was an overemphasis on, for example, on what looked like just nationalisation for the sake of it. And actually, we've already discovered that we can nationalise the railways without actually even having to nationalise them. They are actually nationalised now. Happened just by ending, frankly, the franchise arrangements. We just did it. And nobody noticed. So there were some narratives there which I think weren't incredibly helpful. But let's go back to this story about narratives, because narratives are key to this. This is what makes politics work. You know, you talked about the national debt. We don't have a national debt of 2.2 trillion pounds. It's impossible that we have a national debt of 2.2 trillion pounds. Why? Because 900 billion pounds of our so-called national debt is owned by the Treasury. Well, you know, if you owe your mortgage to yourself, you really aren't worried about having to pay it at the end of the month. You aren't worried about the interest rate on it. And yet the government portrays as if this is debt, and it even includes the figure for interest paid on that debt, which it pays to itself in the total figure they claim they're paying for interest to therefore justify austerity. So they're lying. Use the term straightforwardly. I believe those are lies. There is no such thing as a national debt, that sum. But even if you look at the national debt, you then say, well, who's this owed to? Well, you know, do we want to repay 200 billion pounds, which is in national savings? Why? Or do we want to force people out of premium bonds? Do we want to force foreign governments to not hold sterling, which they do by owning UK government bonds? Why wouldn't we want other countries to want to trade with us and hold sterling balances in UK bonds? Why do we want to force pension funds to not own the most secure investment that they can have to underpin their promise to pensioners to pay for the rest of their life, which is a UK government bond? Why do we want to take the most secure mechanism that is available for a bank to hold its money, so to guarantee it can't go bust, which is to provide it with the opportunity to save with the government? Why then is this national debt such a thing? Actually, it's just, as I said before, it's national savings. This is national savings. It's the other side of the equation. I'm an accountant. For every debit, there is a credit. All we hear here is the credits, the downsides, which is what we're talking about when we talk about liabilities. I'm talking about the asset, the debit. The debit is the strength side of this equation on the government's balance sheet. People actually have the opportunity to save with the government, and we should promote it and use it. Now, the point I'm making is that is the same story. The national debt story is the same as the national savings story. They are exactly the same. They're just opposite ways of viewing the same thing. And the left has not been willing to actually create and sell the stories about what it can deliver. It can say we can help balance the books by tackling inequality, which has been promoted by government policies over the last decade of quantitative easing, which have artificially inflated share prices, artificially inflated house prices, and our job is to gradually deflate those over time. It won't be a miracle, it won't happen overnight, because if it did, it would disrupt the financial markets, and we don't want to create that sort of chaotic disruption. We're not revolutionaries, we're people for controlled social change, but we want to make sure that we recreate a balance and a fairness in society around the distribution of wealth. And so we're not going to penalize people for having wealth. We're just going to ask them to make a fair contribution, as much as you do, on the earnings you make from working. Why wouldn't that be fair? So selling the fairness idea, but creating a narrative around it. And then talking about debt, not as debt, but as savings, and saying, we, the government, know how to use this money to deal with the things that you know you want. What is more, we're even going to sell it to you in a way that you can buy the things you want. And I believe the government should be putting out NHS bonds. It should be putting out education bonds. It should be putting out housing bonds. And it should be putting out maybe regional bonds. Because when we go back 100+ years to the glorious era of the local authority in the UK, and when we talk about the time of the Greater London Council, or before that, the London County Council, the London County Council built the very large new housing estates in London. And we look at Birmingham, which was at one point, the biggest house builder in the UK as a local authority. And we look at even small local authorities. They were the people who produced town electricity, town gas, town local transport. They ran the buses or the trams before them. There was this enormous era of public confidence, of investing communally, to create something which was for common good. And all of that was done through bonds. Local authorities issue bonds, people subscribe for them, they identified their savings with a public goal. If we could build that narrative of association between the individual and government and public good, then we build a new type of left. Not everybody will be able to participate because clearly they can't. But there is no reason, again, why we couldn't have a public bank. We once had a thing called the Gyro Bank, long forgotten, but it actually made sure that everybody was banked. Why couldn't this opportunity be used to make sure that those who are excluded at present from banking could be banked in a way that is entirely socially desirable and necessary for the delivery of benefits, to help ensure that we know who is due them, to be able to help them control and manage money in a way that is very hard for many people right now, which I really sympathize with. All of those things are possible. But we need to build narratives and stories about what can be done. And so long as we subscribe to the idea, oh, the debt is a crushing burden on us, which is what John McDonnell did, then we make a mistake, because actually we could use national savings to promote the public good. How did we pay for the Second World War? We actually saved for it. There were war bonds to provide the opportunity for people to save with the government to pay for winning the war. And that debt wasn't repaid after the war was over. It was actually rolled forward and was continued to pay for the NHS, to pay for the reconstruction of the society. We've talked already about a need for a new relationship within society, a new economic way of thinking. That was paid for by debt, and 250% of GDP in 1947. So this is possible. Why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we building those narratives? That's what challenges me. Why aren't we telling ourselves the stories that we need to create to persuade the public themselves that we are not in debt to the tune of 2.2 trillion, but we're actually, at the moment, have net public savings of around 1.4 trillion. And if only we had more, we could achieve so much more for society. We could build 100,000 council houses a year. Wouldn't people want that? Yes, of course they would. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we telling that story, that this is how we can deliver? I don't know. I wish I did. But that's the challenge that we face, I believe, now, to create the politics that we need genuinely for the 21st century.
I really appreciate you giving me your time. I'm sure you're a busy man. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you?
Blog is Tax Research UK, although it is by no means only about tax now. It's been running since 2006 and it started on tax, but it now deals with political economy in quite a broad spectrum, and the economics and accounting sometimes as well. You can find me on Twitter at Richard J. Murphy.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for coming on.
That's all right. Thank you for having me.